We begin tonight with breaking news out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Just before 4 a.m., emergency crews responded to a reported shooting near a residential neighborhood close to the University of North Carolina campus. Officers arrived. They found a young woman lying in the street beside her vehicle. She had been shot multiple times. The victim was still alive when first responders reached her. She was rushed to the hospital. She did not survive. Police have identified the victim as 22-year-old Eve Carson. Carson was a senior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was also the university's student body president. Authorities say her car was still at the scene. Her personal belongings were inside. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Investigators say the shooting happened just moments after Carson parked her car and stepped outside. There were no immediate witnesses. No weapon was recovered. And police say there was no clear motive. In a town known for safety, and on a campus where violent crime is rare, the question investigators are now asking is a simple one. Why was Eve Carson killed?
This is a true story. It involves a loss that cannot be undone. In the early hours of March 5, 2008, a young woman was shot just steps from her home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Her name was Eve Carson. What happened to her would ripple far beyond a single street or a single night. It would expose how quickly safety can vanish, how fragile certainty can be, and how difficult the truth can be to untangle. The events you are about to hear have been reconstructed using police reports, court records, and contemporaneous news coverage. Some details have been limited out of respect for the victim and her family. This is not a story about speculation. It is not a story about rumor. It is a story about what is known and what was proven. Viewers' discretion is advised. Before she became a headline, before her name was spoken in courtrooms and newsrooms, Eve Carson was simply living her life. She was 22 years old, a senior at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. A student known for discipline, intelligence, and relentless drive. Eve was studying political science and biology. She planned carefully. She worked relentlessly. And she expected a great deal from herself. In the months leading up to her death, Eve had taken on one of the most demanding roles on campus. She was serving as student body president. The position placed her at the center of campus life, meeting with administrators, advocating for students, balancing leadership with academic pressure. Friends would later describe her as focused, warm, and principled. Someone who listened. Someone who followed through. Her days were structured. Her routines familiar. Classes. Meetings. Late nights studying. Like many students, Eve often worked late. And like many students in Chapel Hill, she believed she was safe. On the night of March 4, 2008, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. She spent time with friends. She studied. She followed her usual routine. Sometime after 2 o'clock in the morning, Eve left a friend's apartment. She walked alone to her car. It was a short walk, one she had made many times before. There were no reports of fear. No indication that she sensed danger. This would be the last ordinary moment of her life. Within minutes, that routine would be shattered. And the person her family knew, the leader her classmates respected, the future so carefully built, would be gone. Chapel Hill, North Carolina. A college town shaped by routine, by schedules, by tradition. Home to one of the oldest public universities in the United States. A place where academic life dictates the rhythm of the day, and the school calendar quietly governs the year. On paper, Chapel Hill is statistically safe. Violent crime rates here have historically been lower than national averages. Homicides are rare, especially ones involving students. For decades, this reputation shaped how people moved through the town. Doors were often left unlocked. Late-night walks were common. Familiar streets bred familiarity, not fear. The campus itself sits at the center of town. Academic buildings bleed into residential neighborhoods. Students live not behind gates, but among the community. This closeness created a sense of shared space and shared safety. But it also blurred boundaries. By 2 o'clock in the morning, Chapel Hill grows quiet. Most lights are off. Traffic thins. The campus empties. What remains are pockets of darkness. Side streets. Parking areas. Short walks that feel insignificant. Until they aren't. In the years leading up to 2008, crime in Chapel Hill was rarely front-page news. When it happened, it felt distant. The idea that someone could be attacked just steps from their home, after an ordinary night, didn't fit the town's identity. That belief mattered. Because belief shapes behavior. Students walked alone. They parked where it was convenient. They trusted the environment around them. And for the most part, that trust had never been broken. Until it was. The street where Eve Carson was shot was not an alley. It was not abandoned. It was a residential area. A place people passed through every day. A place that looked like countless others. And that familiarity would later make what happened there even harder to accept. Because if this could happen here, in a town like this, then it could happen anywhere. The night did not begin with chaos. There were no alarms, no raised voices, no warning. It was early morning. Just after 2 o'clock. Eve Carson parked her car near her apartment. The engine stopped. The lights went out. She opened the door and stepped outside. What happened next unfolded in minutes. Investigators would later determine that Eve was confronted almost immediately after exiting her vehicle. There was no sign she was followed for long. No indication she was targeted earlier in the evening. The encounter happened here. On this street. In this moment. Evidence suggests there was a brief struggle. Not prolonged. Not chaotic. She was shot multiple times at close range. The gunfire shattered the quiet of the neighborhood. Residents would later report hearing noises, but not understanding what they were. By the time anyone looked outside, it was already over. Eve collapsed near her car. The vehicle remained at the scene. Her personal belongings were still inside. Her purse. Her phone. Nothing appeared to be taken. Nothing appeared to be missing. At approximately 3:40 a.m., emergency services received a call. Officers were dispatched. When police arrived, they found Eve lying in the roadway. She was barely alive. First responders attempted life-saving measures. She was transported to the hospital. She would later be pronounced dead. Almost immediately, investigators faced a problem. This did not look like a robbery. It did not resemble a sexual assault. And it did not fit the pattern of random violence commonly seen in the area. There was no murder weapon. No immediate witnesses. And no clear motive. What they did have was a scene that raised more questions than answers. Why approach her at that moment? Why use lethal force? And why leave everything behind? Investigators would later say that the absence of theft was one of the most troubling details, because it meant this was not impulsive in the way they expected. Something about this encounter had escalated quickly, but at the scene. No one yet knew why. All they knew was that a young woman had stepped out of her car and never made it inside. By sunrise, the street was no longer quiet. Police tape stretched across the road. Detectives moved carefully through the scene. The investigation into Eve Carson's death began immediately. The first priority was simple. Secure the area. Preserve evidence. and determine what kind of crime this was. That question proved harder to answer than expected. Investigators from the Chapel Hill Police Department began reconstructing the final minutes of Eve's life. They documented the position of her car, the location of shell casings, the condition of the surrounding area. Nothing appeared disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of theft. That immediately complicated things. Robbery is one of the most common motives in street-level shootings. But here, there was no clear reward. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They interviewed residents. Some recalled hearing noises, a sound, a disturbance, but no one saw the shooter. No one saw the confrontation. At this stage, there were no suspects, only possibilities. Was this random? Was it targeted? Was it a crime of opportunity? Investigators reviewed Eve Carson's background, her academic records, her leadership role, her personal life. They found no history of threats, no known conflicts, nothing to suggest she was being targeted, which made the lack of motive even more troubling. As word of the killing spread, pressure mounted. The victim was not anonymous. She was the student body president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The case drew immediate attention from campus administrators, students, and media outlets across the state. Investigators knew time mattered. Memories fade. Evidence disappears. Then, within days, something shifted. Police received information about a vehicle. A car reported stolen in Durham. Surveillance footage showed multiple individuals inside it. The vehicle had been seen in Chapel Hill, and it placed potential suspects in the area. This was the first tangible lead. Investigators began tracing movements, tracking timelines, connecting locations. Within 3 days of the shooting, arrests were made. 3 young men were taken into custody. They were charged in connection with Eve Carson's death. Authorities announced that the crime was not random, but the details were far from clear. What investigators had gained in momentum, they lost in certainty. Because as the case moved forward, the story would only grow more complicated. With arrests made, the case appeared to be moving quickly. Too quickly, some would later argue. Police identified 3 suspects. They were not students. They were not from Chapel Hill. And they had no known connection to Eve Carson. Their names would soon become public. DeMario Atwater, Jonathan Lovett, Christopher Bradford. All 3 were young men. All 3 had criminal histories. And all 3 were connected to a stolen vehicle investigators believed played a role in the crime. According to court records, the group had been driving a car stolen earlier that night in Durham. Prosecutors would later argue that they entered Chapel Hill looking for another vehicle. A carjacking, not a murder. The theory was simple. They saw Eve Carson park her car. They approached her. And something went wrong. But simple theories rarely survive scrutiny. As detectives separated the suspects and conducted interviews, their stories began to diverge. Each suspect placed blame elsewhere. Each minimized his own role. Statements conflicted. Timelines shifted. Details changed. Investigators now faced a familiar problem. 3 suspects, 1 victim, and only fragments of the truth. According to testimony, one suspect claimed the plan was only to steal a car. Another said he never expected a weapon to be used. A third admitted being present, but denied pulling the trigger. No confession clearly identified the shooter. And the murder weapon was never recovered. Public reaction shifted. At first, there was relief. Arrests meant answers. Answers meant closure. But as more information emerged, doubts began to surface. Why was Eve shot multiple times if the goal was theft? Why leave the car behind? Why take nothing? Defense attorneys seized on these questions. They argued the evidence was circumstantial, that the prosecution could not definitively prove who fired the fatal shots. The case began to fracture. Plea negotiations followed. One suspect agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony became central to the prosecution's case. But it also raised new concerns. Was he telling the truth? Or telling the version that benefited him most? Media coverage intensified. Public opinion split. Some believed justice was inevitable. Others believed the full story was slipping away. What was clear was that the case was no longer straightforward. The closer investigators came to resolution, the more complicated the truth appeared to be. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the investigation had reached a crossroads. What investigators lacked in physical evidence, they now attempted to replace with testimony. Prosecutors advanced a single narrative: that Eve Carson's death occurred during an attempted carjacking, and that all three defendants were legally responsible, even if only one pulled the trigger. It was a theory grounded in the felony murder rule. If a death occurs during the commission of a violent felony, all participants can be held accountable. But the strength of that theory depended on cooperation. And cooperation came at a cost. One defendant agreed to testify against the others: Christopher Bradford. In exchange, prosecutors offered a reduced sentence. His account became the backbone of the case. According to his testimony, the group entered Chapel Hill intending to steal a vehicle. They approached Eve Carson after she parked, and during the encounter shots were fired. Bradford identified another defendant as the shooter. That defendant was DeMario Atwater. Atwater denied the accusation. He maintained that he did not fire the weapon, that he did not intend for anyone to be hurt. But under the law, intent no longer mattered. In 2009, Atwater was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The third defendant, Jonathan Lavette, entered a plea agreement. He received a reduced sentence for his role. The courtroom fell silent as sentences were read. For the Carson family, the outcome brought finality, but not clarity. There was still no murder weapon, no forensic evidence conclusively tying any one person to the fatal shots. Only testimony. Testimony given in exchange for leniency. In the years that followed, appeals were filed, arguments raised, questions revisited. But the convictions stood. Legally, the case was closed. Emotionally, it never truly was. What some viewed as a breakthrough, others viewed as a collapse. Justice delivered, but truth still contested. In the end, the courtroom delivered an outcome, but not an ending. The trial concluded with convictions. Sentences were imposed, and the case, in the eyes of the law, reached its conclusion. DeMario Atwater was convicted of first-degree murder. Under North Carolina law, the conviction carried a mandatory sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jonathan Lavette received a lesser sentence after entering a plea agreement. His punishment reflected cooperation and a reduced level of culpability. Christopher Bradford, whose testimony became central to the prosecution's case, also received a reduced sentence. Each outcome was legally justified. Each followed the rules of the system. But legal resolution does not always bring emotional resolution. For Eve Carson's family, the trial marked the end of a long and public ordeal. There would be no more hearings, no more testimony, no more waiting. The person responsible, the court ruled, would never walk free. And yet, questions remained. No physical evidence ever definitively established who fired the fatal shots. The murder weapon was never found. The case relied heavily on testimony. Testimony given by individuals with incentive to reduce their own punishment. Defense attorneys argued this point repeatedly. They questioned the credibility of cooperating witnesses. They challenged the lack of forensic certainty. Appeals followed. Arguments were reviewed. But appellate courts upheld the convictions. The legal standard had been met. The verdict stood. Justice, according to the system, had been served. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was less settled. Some believed the outcome was appropriate. That accountability mattered more than precision. Others questioned whether the full truth had ever emerged. Was the fatal decision made in an instant? Was it intentional? Or was it the result of panic, compounded by poor choices and irreversible consequences? Those questions were never answered conclusively, because the law did not require them to be. What it required was participation, presence, and responsibility under the felony murder rule. In that framework, the precise moment the trigger was pulled mattered less than the fact that the crime was already underway. For some, that distinction was enough. For others, it was not. Years later, the case remains officially closed. No further charges are pending. No new suspects have been named. But the unanswered questions linger. Not in court files, but in memory. Because while the trial delivered a verdict, it could not deliver certainty. Eve Carson's life was cut short in the quiet hours of March 5, 2008. She was 22 years old. A student leader, a scholar, a friend, a daughter. In the years since, the legal system moved forward. Convictions were handed down. Sentences were imposed. For many, the case stands as a lesson in accountability. A demonstration that crime carries consequences. But for the Carson family, for the students of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, for a community shaken to its core, the impact extends far beyond the courtroom. Campus safety policies were revisited. Student awareness initiatives were implemented. Memorials were established to honor her life and leadership. Yet, even with these changes, one truth remains undeniable. A young woman, full of promise, was taken in an instant. Her family, her friends, and her peers were left to grapple with absence. And the questions left behind are not easily answered. Could this have been prevented? Could a different choice, a different circumstance, have saved her life? We may never know. What we do know is the way her death reshaped a community. It reminded everyone that safety is fragile, that ordinary routines can hide danger, and that tragedy can strike when it is least expected. Today, the streets of Chapel Hill are the same. Students walk them daily. Cars travel the same roads. Yet the memory of that night lingers, unseen but deeply felt. Eve Carson's story is not just about crime and punishment. It is about lives interrupted, potential unfulfilled, and a family forever changed. To this day, no one can say for certain what might have prevented it. And perhaps the most disturbing part is how easily it could happen again. Eve Carson's life, her loss, and her memory remain a solemn reminder of what we value, what we protect, and what can be lost in a single, irretrievable moment. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.